Good morning. We are continuing summary review of the conclusion of Ayin Beis. We are in volume 3 on page 1453. Aleph Tov Nun Gimel. And after a good 2.5 pages, Rabbi Rashab returns now to explain why Krishma is compared to Achalti Divshi. The whole verse is Achalti Yari Im Divshi. I've eaten the honeycomb together with the honey. What is the honey? The honey represents Krishma, and specifically the Avodah with tam ve'ineg. Honey, sweetness of honey represents the pleasure, the einig, the ava betainugim, as he put it, the ava. In order to come to love God, not just to know God, not just to appreciate Him, not just to understand Him, but to turn it into a personal, intimate experience of ava, like we learned at length, that requires a powerful contemplation on what God is and the reality of God, as he summed it up at the bottom of page 1452. But additionally, it needs that the bonus, the contemplation and the asaga and the comprehension should be saturated with its pleasure. Shouldn't be what he called before kridus, cold, apathetic, detached, technical, but something that awakens, stimulates not just the mind, but also the heart, to the point that the heart itself feels love. And love means that you are subjectively drawn and attracted to the thing that you love. In this case, Hashem Echad, godliness. When you realize that the true source of life and the true source of pleasure is God, so why would you want to have only a product of that? You want to have the source of it itself. Hu chayecha, as he said. It's our life, it's our sustenance. And he explained in the parentheses, because the neshamas are rooted in Atzmus Ein Sof, Torah too, God infused himself or embedded himself into Torah mitzvahs, like we learned v'yichuli truma. So therefore, you could say by neshamas chayecha hu atzme kavyachol, hu chayecha, that God is our very sustenance. The truth is, God is the sustenance of all of existence. But in a sense, if you think of it in the language of Tanya, that we are like a child, bonim atem l'Hashem alekechem, from the very DNA. Obviously, it's even more directly, because the rest of existence, you could say, is a product of God's. Yes, created by God, the creation of God, but we also have that additional relationship, that there's something, so to speak, that God imbued within us. The Tzelem Alekim, here he uses the word Atzmusi is Baruch in the Neshamas Yisrael. Okay. And that's why the person, when you contemplate on that, you realize that you have tremendous pleasure in this source of time. Mamish. And the love to God won't be, if you think about God as an abstract creator, it's one thing. But when you realize that this is the source of who you are, the very essence of who you are, then you love it just as much as you love your own life. So the interesting twist here, in a way, is usually we say when you love yourself, you don't love anything but yourself, and God included. Your love of yourself comes first. But if you really understand where you originate from, then loving God is actually loving yourself. It's loving the very source of who you are, the source of your life. Chayecha, as he put it. And the same thing, so summing up that the same thing, that's regarding in a physical example of life. Same thing when it connects to God, when it relates to God. And that's divshi. And that's the meaning of the divshi in Shema, the honey, my honey. That what? Why is it divshi? Because the Krishma, ava amitis b'chinas ava b'tanugim. Because the love in Krishma is a true love, not a superficial one, not a and not we'll call it not ulterior motive driven, and that's ave betanugim, which is what Divshi represents here, the sweetness of the honey. And that's only through the gili of havaya beliboy, rather beliboy. That's through the revelation of the divine law of Havaya Hashem in his heart. Actually, I see. Okay, that's where I stopped, and I actually skipped a line. I realized. We'll learn it out anyway. So let me start from Vizel. That we're going to start from Ze Inyan Divshi. Even though we learned it yesterday, we'll go over it again. So on around, let's see, 3, 6, around eight lines from the top of page 1453, and we're going to continue to describe. He's now going to sum up the conclusion of the beginning of the topic. Why Echalti Divshi is refers to Shema.
Can you take a question?
And the pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. You want to ask something?
Yes, please. So I did listen to the class yesterday, even though I was not present because I was traveling. And I understand everything that's been given over here. The question is, even if one can accomplish the understanding, the contemplation that everything in reality is a manifestation in or sourced from the Eibishter, and so whatever we love here in this physical reality, essentially we ought to love the source of it so much more so. I get that, and when you look at your children and their neshama is beautiful, that can inspire tainugim, enjoyment, pleasure, but we also know the life here in this physical reality is very difficult, and a lot of people are dealing with a lot of tsuras. So when you say, everything you have is sourced in Hashem, and of course that includes, the good, the bad, and the ugly. People, and you should, even this Hashem b'simchi should be happy, but we struggle sometimes. We have tsuras, and so when you say, love God and feel sweet and be happy when you're in the middle of tzara, es tzara, it seems this is nice in a theory, but in reality, when you're in ace tzara, which is not, some people more, some people less, but this is no skipping the tulips here, that seems a little harder to be so freilich when you're going, then mamish is the hefech. So the Eibishter wants me to suffer. This is a much more difficult kasha.
Well, I thought I preempted that question in my discussion yesterday when I explained it in more detail. So let me just say this. First of all, as I explained yesterday, each of us is on our own level. Not everyone's going to have the same ability, at least initially, to experience the Ein Mulvade that he talks about here. The words that he uses, that the only reality is God, Hu Levade Hu ve'ein zulose klal, like he says, Ein zulose klal, that he is the only reality. As I said, even without sorrows, even without problems, to experience 24/7 this kind of experience that God is the only reality is almost impossible for most people. We have work, we have the distractions, and we of course have a nefesh habamis that has this interest. So before we even get to tsaros that you asked about, the very existence of a person to have this level is obviously every person has to figure out. So I explained that each of us has to find that moment, and we climb the ladder, each one according to our level. Like that's why Shema Yisrael is said by each person on their level. So that's number one. And we have to, yes, absolutely. This neshama is concealed. Even the best life on this earth, the neshama is concealed inside of a body. We have a life to live. We have all kinds of physical distractions, health, parnasa, livelihood, family. Just the wear and tear of life itself is quite challenging. So that's why you learn chassidus. That's why the Hashem gave us a Torah. He put us in this world and said, yes, it's a difficult world, but I'm giving you many resources, many siyua. We put pages upon pages. We talked about the help we need and the support systems that we have. But the only way you can access is by learning it, because the fact is, physical world is very, very tangible, and we don't need to make any effort to experience the physical world. The spiritual world, and especially the powers that God gives us, it takes effort and takes work. That's why we have to daven 3 times a day and every day again and again. You could say, why? You davened yesterday. Why do you have to daven today? Because it's a very big uphill battle and it's a challenge. And all of Torah and Chassidus was given to us to do exactly that. Now, once that's said, you talk about Avram Avinu discovering God, and then his children, and then the Jews going through Egypt. We have also suffered greatly. When you talk about the suffering that you're talking about, we've suffered for thousands of years. But that's exactly when you need God more than ever. Because when you suffer, what recourse do you have? And that's actually what saved the Jewish people, both collectively and individually, their faith in God. So they did not complain, why are you causing these problems? They understood it's part of life, part of the mysteries of life, but they also never neglected or ignored or forgot that, number one, the mere fact that we're alive to complain is also a gift, because God could have not created it all, and we wouldn't have been here. We had nothing to complain about. There's no pain, there's no joy, there's no nothing. So the Jewish people always understood, and they understood it because they said Shema Yisrael every day, many times a day. And they understood it because they studied Torah and they did mitzvahs. And now when we learn Chassidus, that's what it teaches us. That always remember all of existence is only here because God wants it, because he's giving us a gift, the gift of life. Yes, the mysteries of life include pain and suffering and ups and downs and sometimes terrible suffering. But the suffering is never the ultimate. The ultimate is the goodness of God. And the suffering is, like I always point out, one suffers, but you're not a sufferer. It doesn't define you. What defines you is your neshama. Now, people who don't learn Chassidus, who've not learned about God, yes, that's one of the biggest problems in our society today. People are defined by their circumstances. And if someone suffers, they say, I don't have the ability. Why are you telling me, what are you talking to me about God? The way you put it, for example, life is terrible. Why are you talking to me about God? Because they don't understand that God actually would help you get beyond that, because it would give you another reality. Like I mentioned the story of the Frierdiker Rebbe, a gun was pointed to his head. You think he wanted to die? God forbid. But he said, this toy cannot frighten someone that has one God and many worlds. And that's exactly what Chassidus comes to teach. So it's not coming to teach us to go into denial or to ignore or to minimize the pains of life. It's coming to teach us there's a far bigger reality. That's number one. And that far bigger reality is the ikr. Like he says, that is the truth. So what you think when Jews were suffering, the only solace they had was that they're connected to something that's not part of this world. Now, is it easy? No, it's not easy. I said, even in good times, it's not easy to connect to God, let alone in difficult times. But in difficult times, you need it even more. That's why you actually find that people turn to God sometimes in crisis and pain more than in comforts. Because then what's the excuse for someone who's living a very good life and they just consume with their own comfort zone and their own pleasures? So bottom line is that this is exactly what Chassidus Torah in general, and Chassidus in particular, is coming to address the real challenges of life, whether it's bigger challenges or smaller challenges, and opening us up to a bigger reality, that we're not these small little people that are victims of circumstances. We're not anybody's victim. We're not anyone's mercy. Mordechai did not bow to anything. Jews don't bow to anyone, only to a higher reality. And that's essentially the challenge. Now, of course, when people are suffering and they have no idea of God, it's very difficult for them. That's why you can't really build a strong ship in the middle of a storm. That's why you try to learn Chassidus before the storm strikes, because once a person is in a very deep and dark place, very hard to tell them, okay, let's learn a Maimer Chassidus and you'll get out of your difficulties, because it's not the case. Even with learning Chassidus, it's difficult, but that's why we learn all the time, and we're constantly trying to strengthen our immune systems. I mean, spiritual immune systems, emotional, psychological immune systems, to be able to be more resilient and be able to deal with all the challenges of life. That's my response.
Bobby, that was beautiful. Thank you very much. That was, of course, I know these things, but I'm glad you addressed the issue. Thank you.
Okay.
If I can say, Rabbi, because you are inside of Hasidim, you might don't even feel it. It's like a essential of your blood. But as I know, Hasidim was the first thing is bittul, nullification and surrender. And everything that is going on with us, the best art we can take from Hasidim is surrender. And make sure I remember the history of Hasidim. The first Hasidim didn't even pronounce the word I, because they were so bitter in front of the authority, in front of rabbis, that
okay, and here you have that language in the Maimer right here. He's talking exactly about that, about the bitl of Hashem Echad, that when we say Shema Yisrael, that's exactly the point. There's Yehuda Tata and Yehuda Ilah. So correct.
Yes.
Yeah.
For outsider as me and Itzhak, it should be highlighted because we were not raised in this.
It doesn't matter. Many people raised in it have not necessarily internalized it. So don't be so hard on yourself. Man, you're sitting and learning Ayin Beis every day. I don't know if everybody who's raised in it is learning Ayin Beis every day. So just for the record, there's plenty of challenges for those that were raised in it. It's true, they may be on one hand easier, but they also could take it for granted and sometimes becomes mechanical. Bottom line, all of us need work. Tanya was not just written for those that were not raised in it. It's written for everybody, and everybody needs that work to get to Karav Elecha Dover Ma'id, or what we're learning here. This type of experience is really universal across the board. Everybody, according to their level. But I understand what you're saying, that in the secular world, there's less focus on bittul and so on. But I just wanted to make that clear as well.
And this is a key point in loving Hashem no matter what.
Yeah. Okay. So let's continue now. The line V'zeh inyan divshi. It said 8 lines from the top of page 1453. And the pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. V'zeh inyan divshi b'krishma. Lias ha'ava de krishma ha'ava amitis b'chinas ava b'tainugim. The idea of divshi, my honey, in Krishma is because Krishma is not just Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. It's meant to lead to V'haftas Hashem Elokecha, V'ava ben Krishma, which is a true love. He kept using the word true love because you can have a love that is temporary, not sustainable, superficial. But here we're talking about a true love, and he also explains it's a true love because you're dealing with connecting to the truest reality of all, and that is called Ava b'tainugim, not just a love, but a love with pleasure. And Divshi is the emphasis on Ava also, but on Chayes b'tainug, tainugim. And as I've told, as we've discussed, there's different levels of Ava. You'll find the word Ava Zuta, Ava Rabba, there's Ava Kiddush Be'esh, Ava Kamayim, there's Ava B'chol Levavcha, B'chol Nafshcha, B'chol Meidecha, and Ava b'tainugim is usually referred to one of the highest, or if not the highest level of Ava. It's not just Ava, it's with profound pleasure, because you're completely immersed in it, as we learned earlier. The more you're immersed, the more the pleasure there is. And that happens, as we said, because the Havaya Echad is not just revealed in his mind, but in his heart. Zeu Gamkein, Mashin is ill. This will connect back, if you recall, when he spoke about Neshama saying Shema, in contrast to Malachim, that we say in Birchas Yetzer, even though they help prepare us and they are a siyua, support, but they're a lower level, because he said there, used the expression from Zohar that in Shema we bind ourselves, become absorbed, begufa de malka, the very body of the king. It's obviously a mashal, but in other words, you could have a relationship with the king by listening to his commands, by following his guidelines, etc., by studying his teachings. But lishtaba begufa de malka means that you're embracing him, you're like hugging him, and embrace, and it's the gufa de malka. Remember, we learned about mitzvahs. Is the Ramache Varin de Malka? They're the 248 organs of the king. But Gufa de Malka is the whole guf, and that's why Shema is Klolos Kol HaMitzvahs. Because that's what we're doing. When we saying Hashem, when we contemplate, we're saying and contemplating on Hashem Echad, and is then being drawn through the contemplation with Tam and Einig into the heart, and affecting Ki ba'ave b'tainugim hu b'chinas bitl v'iskalus mamish be'er Hashem ein sof baruch hu. Because when you have ave b'tainugim, you have the ultimate, an utter bitl, and being encompassed, iskalus mamish, in Eir ein sof baruch hu, in Eir Hashem ein sof baruch hu. So in other words, as we know, in love, there are many levels. You could love someone, and not necessarily is it all-encompassing. It could be partial, it could be temporary, it could be for a certain period of time, it could be in a certain area. But when it's ava b'tainugim, it means it's totally all-encompassing, as we learned before. And that is going to explain why we say achalti. Because you could also say shma is like honey, but achalti is more than just honey. You're consuming it, and it's becoming part of your flesh and blood. So that's the connection. The shtaba begufa de malka, we're actually making it part of who we are. The ze'in achalti divshi. And that's why we say that we're eating the honey. Like food. When you eat something, it's not just, actually in Tanya, in chapter 5, when he explains the difference between Torah and mitzvahs, he actually says that mitzvahs is levushim. It's like wearing a garment. And Torah is teiroscha b'seich meyai. It's like ingesting it. Because when you learn Torah, it's internalized. A mitzvah does not become like internal, like a Torah, an idea. When you learn Torah, he says the seichel of the person becomes one with the seichel of Torah. When you do a mitzvah, you're not becoming one with the mitzvah. You're becoming one with Hashem who gave you the mitzvah. You don't become one with the tefillin. The tefillin is like a garment that you bound yourself with. Or I'm not talking about mitzvah like you're eating matzah. That's a mitzvah of achila. But most mitzvahs that are not connected to that, you're doing the mitzvah. You're acting on the mitzvah. You're sitting in a sukkah. You're taking daled minim. Or any other mitzvah. Tzitzis, talis. These are all together of levushim, which he calls more makif. It has its role. But pnimius, so achalti divshi, is saying that you're not just experiencing it, you're consuming it. So just like food, as it breaks down, the nutrients becomes part of your blood. In madam nefesh kamay kain, b'chinas mesikus v'taynagan al mesachad mamish be'erein sof baruch hu. So that's the mashal why it says achalti divshi. Same thing, the mesikus v'taynagan, the sweetness and pleasure that discussed earlier, that is in the Shema, in the V'hafta, Mesach and Mamish completely is united be'erein sof baruch hu. Now I asked yesterday, I suggested, if you think about it, when you eat something, it's becoming part of you. So here you could say, the Shema, like honey, when it's with Ava b'tainugim, it's becoming like honey that's becoming part of you. But he's saying more than that, it's becoming gufa de malka, which is interesting. He's taking it a step further. So I think the answer to that is because the fact of the matter is, like I mentioned with the Evarim de Malka, when we do a mitzvah, let's say tzedakah, that's the example he gives in Tanya, chapter 23. When you give tzedakah, your hand now is like an extension of God's hand, so to speak. Chesed of Atzilus. You're becoming a merkava, a vehicle, a channel for God's hand. So even though it's your hand, but your hand is now channeling God's chesed. So perhaps the same idea here, that even though it's true, the Ava b'tainugim is internalized within us, but it's an Ava b'tainugim to Hashem. So it also connects directly with the guf of the Malka. That's the thought I have when I think about the example he's giving here. But I've got to think about it some more. Maybe there's more to this. We'll see. But bottom line is that it's a total hisachdus. That's what achila represents. That you are completely. Another point, divshi here, honey is not honey, physical honey. Honey here is Krishma. What are you internalizing? You're internalizing Hashem Echad. That's what he said, Hashem Echad belibe. So not just that you're experiencing pleasure, you're internalizing that pleasure. So you're internalizing godliness within you. So that is additionally, that I think is the main point that I would say is the main reason he calls it Tisachdus Mamish Be'erein sof baruch hu. So on one hand, it's Mesached with you, but it's also, what is Mesached with you? Elikus. Because it's Hashem Echad that is there's the message of Shema. Okay. Fine. Now he's going to add some more. He says, V'yesh leimer, and we can say there's another feature in honey that can be applied here. So as always, a moshel in the Torah says the pasuk divshi, the moshel can have many, many aspects to it. And Chassidus Chabad, of course, the Alter Rebbe, one of his innovations was to show in every moshel how we mipsari echza lekah, from my flesh I behold God. Every physical object can teach us so many levels of elikus because it was created by God. So there's another aspect of dvash, of honey, that can help us as well understand the connection to Shema. And so yesh leimer means our Rebbe Rashab is adding this. The kamoy hadvash comes to honey. Honey is not just sweet, but it also causes other things to become part of it. Shemahapach kol dover ledvash. When you put sugar, for example, on something, you sweeten it, but you're not turning that object. Let's say you put sugar on a fruit, on strawberry. It doesn't change the strawberry into sugar. When you put something in dvash, after a while, it becomes dvash. It'll be absorbed, and it will become the part of the dvash. Kamoy Kain, he's saying, so too, since this is an example for what? This dvash is an example for the sweetness and the pleasure that a person is enjoying, celebrating, or satisfaction in God, godliness. But pnimius nekudis libe, in the inner core of his heart. So that, just like with the dvash, mahapach say memuhus lemuhus. So in addition to it becoming one with you, like food that becomes part of your blood, it transforms you. Transforms the person, memuhus lemuhus. And now he explains what that means. V'hu, shetoshev ha'nefesh la'lekim v'tisapich l'bchinas ha'lekus mamash. So remember, the nefesh came down into a body. So the nefesh retained, obviously, its divine nature, but it's affected by the body. Like we learned, the body conceals it, the animal soul. And the goal, of course, is not just that the nefesh should reclaim its divine connection. You want it to be able to reconnect to the core itself, the essence itself. So he's saying that since now the nefesh has become part of life down below, how could that nefesh experience godliness on the highest level? But being that he's comparing it to dvash, he's saying that dvash, in addition to internalizing and becoming integrated, the sweetness of godliness and the sweetness, the tainug in alikus, is becoming integrated, internalized, it actually also has a transformative effect. Like dvash, that transforms things that are placed into that honey. That's why you find, I think honey is, the ultimate preservative as well, because of this reason. But we'll discuss that in a moment. Let me just finish this point. So shetoshev ha'nefesh la'lekim. So we say ruach toshev ha'lekim asher nasam. The nefesh should return l'lekim v'tisapich l'bchinas ha'lekus mamish, and it should be transformed to ha'lekus mamish. So he's going to qualify what I just said. Why does it have to be transformed? It's only been concealed. The neshama never lost its core elikus within it, as we've discussed. So even though it's elikus be'etzem kaneda, so what are you saying that it's transformed? It's a key point. Once the neshama comes down below, it becomes a mitzias. Above, the neshama is completely absorbed in godliness. Comes down below, sometimes the expression of chassidus is elikus shenase yesh. I actually wrote about it in this week's section of my continuing essay. So elikus shenase yesh. That's what makes Torah different than the neshamas. A Torah never assumes a body. A Torah always remains Torah. It does come down levels, so the Torah speaks about material matters in this world, but the Torah itself always remains holy and removed from existence. And the neshama comes down into a body, bislapshus. It's not just passing through. The years that the neshama spends in this world is completely immersed in it. So it's called elikus shenas yesh. And the reason for that, if you recall, was because the neshama comes from such a high level. Remember, on top of page 1450, he said that. Because they come from such a high level, that's why they can come down into a body and an animal soul. Malachim can't do that. Spheres can't do it. No spiritual levels can do that because they would not be able to handle this material world. But the fact is, a neshama does come down and manifests. Like the expression is, holach l'karta, I'm sorry, oza l'karta holach b'nimusa. When a person comes to a city, you behave like the city is. It's used twice. When the Malachim came to Avram Avinu, they ate and drank, even though Malachim don't eat and drink, because that's the custom of the land. So they didn't become eaters and drinkers, but they, at least, and the same thing Moshe Rabbeinu, when he went on Mount Sinai, it says he didn't eat, because in heaven the Malachim don't eat. Point being is, on a deeper level, and the Neshama comes down below, it assumes the properties of this world. So though it retains its etzem elikus, but it does assume the properties. So even now we're learning Torah. The neshama is engaged in this, but the neshama is speaking the language of this world, and as I said, it becomes a mitzias neshama. So therefore, that's why you could say that you wanted to have a sapchim amuhus lemuhus, which is what Shema does. So Shema doesn't just reveal the divine in the neshama, that's obvious. It doesn't only internalize it, but also transforms that the neshama, even though it became a mitzias down here, that neshama should reconnect to the way it was before it was a mitzias, meaning the way it is completely one with God. Then the Rebbe Rashab adds one more thing in this parenthesis. Das Tachten. Okay, and he brings the Maimer. That's the beer in Lekut Teira in Parsha Bolok. So it's very brief, but I'll explain it. What he's saying is, once the neshama comes down below, why do we need Yehuda Tata? If the neshama is be'etzem elikus, why do we even need the concept of beginning the process by first contemplating on the divine within existence and realizing that all of existence is yesh ma'ayin? But it's a yesh. The existence is a yesh. And you come to realize that yesh is rooted in the ayin. But it's bitla yesh, because it's das tachten. It's the perspective of godliness through the eyes and lens of this world. Because that's how the neshama, when it comes down below, it has to begin that way. As we learned earlier, the sulam mutzav arza, the ladder, stands on the ground. When you start davening, you don't just jump to Hashem Echad. And you don't right away go to Yechudei Law. First, you have to acclimate yourself to the godliness that you relate to. As we discussed at length, mutfa, murgish, muskul, the levels that we go through. So as such, he's adding now that firstly the neshama becomes a mitzias, and then mitzias neshama down below, and initially it's on a level of das tachten, and a level of av al pitam v'das, meaning a love that is not mesiras nefesh yet. We're not talking about yet b'chol nafshecha b'chol ma'adecha. We're talking about firstly just simply a love that makes sense because God created you. It's worthy of showing appreciation and valuing that, and then you start climbing level by level. So we see from this that even though neshama be'etzem is elikus, but it is affected, and that's why, number one, the neshama becomes a mitzias, an existing entity called a soul that enters into your body, and another soul that enters into my body. That means it's a mitzias. Additionally, this neshama has to go through the steps of das tachten and aval pitam v'das, which is bechinas yesh. It's all in the state of a yesh. And it brings that maimer mimana. So therefore, that explains that even though neshama be'etzem is elikus fundamentally, but due to the fact that it has now assumed all these properties, so the dvash of the Shema is helping it actually transform back to where it was, where all the neshamas were absorbed in the shtaba begufa de malka, in the very core essence, rooted batzmus is barach. Okay. And now he goes back. I'm going to stop for a minute in a few minutes for questions, but let me just finish the whole phrase here. So he says, so what happens now when you're transformed? The dvash, the ava and the sikus, the love and the pleasure and the sweetness has transformed this person because they are completely consumed with godliness. So think of it that they're loving God just as we love Gashmias, and that we can relate to. Now that has now been redirected toward loving God. So he says to the point, that he should not have any desire and any the vital of chayis. You can say, well, tainug is pleasure. Chayis means vitality is the right word, but here he means chayis. You know, when you have some excitement, you could say, stimulation and pleasure. Nothing but godliness. So it's not just that you have a love for God, but you also love other things in life. It comes to a point where it's so all-consuming. And I have to qualify what I said yesterday. I said again earlier today. You read this, you think, I can never reach such a level. How is that possible? But that's why the Rebbe Rashab is writing the full picture, the way it's meant to be, and for all people and all neshamas. Each of us has to find the moments and on our level where we could experience at least some of this. I mentioned Yom Kippur. There are moments that a person, but in concept, if you think about it intellectually at least, even though this is meant to be a personal emotional experience, he's saying the fact that if a person can come to this state of chalti divshi in the Shema, so it actually completely transforms him. This is a level like the Oves, Hein Amarkava, which is, we're not on that level, but this is equivalent to that level, that all his faculties are only directed toward Hashem. He brought that pasuk earlier in the bottom of last page. When I have you in heaven, there's nothing else I want. There's nothing else that I desire. And now he goes further. Well, you know what? Let me stop here with Nefesh Elokis before we go further. If anybody wants to ask anything, then he's going to now finish with that. It also affects obviously the faculties of the animal soul. Remember, the goal is ultimately v'ahavta. That also affects the animal soul, as we learned from the Maimer Hamagbi. But let me stop. If anyone wants to ask anything about what we learned till here, then I'll try to finish till the end of the paragraph.
So, does anybody else have a question? I know I always ask a lot of questions, so does anybody want to go ahead of me? Doesn't sound like it. So, Ya'ari, just to, again, flesh out the metaphor, I understand everything you said, so I'm just trying to really drill down on the metaphor. Ya'ari, which is the honeycomb, is the source of the tainug of Shema. So Shema is the tainug.
No, it's not. No. Where'd you get that from?
That's why I'm asking my question.
No, Ya'ari will come the next paragraph. He's going to talk about Ya'ari.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
He didn't get to Ya'ari yet. He's talking now only about the honey part.
I see. Okay.
We'll talk about the honeycomb.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so now he adds that it doesn't just affect the neshama, and all the factors of the animal soul. And this goes back to the Maimer HaMagbil L'Shevis from the Alter Rebbe and from the Mittler Rebbe, where they explained the idea that it affects when the neshama contemplates on Hashem Echad, which is what we're learning here. It also affects the animal soul. Koyach HaMesaveh, and that's called in Chassidus sometimes Koyach HaMesaveh, the power of desire. So there's the power of the desire and there's the object of desire. When we talk about a Nefesh Habamis, it has the power, it desires. What does it desire? Initially, it desires this world, material world, everything it needs for its own interest. So that too is what Hashem Echad affects. You b'bchinis iskafia. So these faculties, which on their own, as he explains in that Maimer, the Nefesh Habamis is drawn to the pleasures of this world, to its own interest. The nefesh halikis is drawn to godliness. But here, that this affects that the nefesh habamis too will be in a state of iskafia. That's from the word kfia. It's being restrained. Ubebchines isapcha. And even deeper, it's being transformed. So the divshi, the honey, is affecting the nefesh habamis too. But nefesh habamis, first you have to restrain it, because it's avde be'afkeda nichale. The nefesh habamis is not interested in being disciplined. And then there's this sapcha chasheicha lenaheda, the darkness to light. And he explains down the parentheses, and this is very much connected to the Maimer HaMagbil L'Shavas, because he literally speaks about this there. And the Rebbe Rashab is adding explanation to that Maimer. So if you remember what we learned there, or if you want to look it up, you'll see there's a lot of additional nuances that he adds here, or even more than nuances. So he says, V'hainu, this means, Shatainug HaGashmi. Because in the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, it just says, the Nefesh Habamis is affected by the Nefesh Halikis's contemplation that God is the only reality. Nefesh Habamis could understand. You want to know where your real life comes from? You know, it's like an example. I'll give a simple example. Someone's working in a company and they want to get a raise, or they want to ingratiate themselves to their superior. And after a while, you find out that this superior doesn't do anything on their own. Everything comes from a boss. So after whatever amounts of time or money or months you spend trying to ingratiate yourself, you suddenly realize I better ingratiate myself to the person who makes the decisions. So in a way, the Nefesh Habamis, initially, it pursues whatever it wants, its pleasures. But then with the Nefesh Halikis educating and say, you know what, you want to really have pleasure, let's go to the real boss. That's God. It's not what you think it is. And the Nefesh Habamis can be convinced, because its interest, even its self-interest, also wants to have more life. It wants to have more success. We're not talking about now forbidden things. So in a way, the Nefesh Halikis can persuade the Nefesh Habamis. But what happens with the natural Nefesh Habamis inclination toward pleasures of this world? So the Rebbe Rashab is saying that Alter Rebbe doesn't really speak about that. He doesn't. Well, I can't say that. Let me correct myself. He does speak about it to some extent. He says the seichel of the Nefesh Habamis becomes part of the seichel of Torah, which is chakim v'lei b'chachmi yediyah. But he doesn't talk about the pleasures of the animal soul. The Rebbe Rashab says the tainug gashmi yegamkin tainug eliki. Like you said, if honey transforms the objects that are inside the honey, what that means here, that when you take the tainug gashmi of the animal soul and you saturate it with the pleasure of elikus, the tainug gashmi will become like the honey of elikus. Ukumaya tainug de Shabbos. An example for that would be the tainug of Shabbos. So we know the weekdays, even though you eat a meal, the meal is a means, you eat it l'shem shemayim. But Shabbos, it's a mitzvah to eat. So the tainug of achila on Shabbos, like he says, it's tainug the Shabbos, the tzaddik eichel the seva nafshe. So we eat usually because we're hungry. A tzaddik eats l'seva nafshi to satisfy his soul. In other words, for spiritual purposes. Shabbos is a level when our meal itself is a mitzvah. Not a mitzvah to eat a meal on the weekday. It's a necessity. It's rishus that you do l'shem shemayim, like I said. But Shabbos, one of the mitzvahs of Tainug Shabbos is through achila. The klolos aved the Shabbos is bechinas ha-Tainug. Because the general aved of Shabbos is einik Shabbos Tainug, pleasure. Shabbos einik. He calls Shabbos pleasure. Oz tisanig al Hashem. That's when you will take pleasure in God. Ubetfilah the Shabbos wa'ava b'tainugim the nefesh halikis. And the prayer, the tefillah in Shabbos, is the love of pleasures of a nefesh halikis. Va'achazat ba'achil the Shabbos. And after davening, when you eat the meal, va'achazat ba'achil the Shabbos, hu inyan tzaddik eichel the seva nafshe. That's like the tzaddik eating to satisfy and sustain the soul. Shagam zehu tainug eliki. And that too becomes a tainug eliki. So it sounds like he's saying that tefillah itself is the divine soul. But the meal afterwards is connected to the animal soul. Even though a tzaddik doesn't have a nefesh habamis, but for the rest of us, our animal soul is involved in eating, but it's a mitzvah. So when the animal soul is taking pleasure in a Shabbos meal, you've transformed the Tainu Gashmi into Tainu Eliki. The commission is boiling ill, where this I think he spoke about in volume 2, I think he's referring to. And with that, he concludes the paragraph. So the parenthesis comes to add basically where's the honey transformation take place in the animal soul. And he says that the Tainug Gashmi should be Tainug Eliki, an example for that. Kamoi, like the Tainug of Shabbos, where the meal itself becomes a Tainug, a mitzvah, a Tainug Eliki. And this concludes the piece with Difshi and Krishma. So here I'll stop for any questions, if there are any. And then, next paragraph, if you'll see, starts the Ori, is going to get into the honeycomb, the first part of the verse. Any questions? Okay. Good. I think I'm going to stop here, even though we have a few more minutes, but I don't want to start the next section without proper introductions and
I was
so
just
on.
going to comment on how much, I mean, this was meaningful the first time we went through it, but how much more meaningful it is after we read the Maimerim Hamakbi L'Sheves, because here we're observing the details of the inyan of the Yichud of Das Tachton and Das Elyon, and the transformation of our perspective from our physical constraints into a perspective from God's perspective, that everything is godliness, and so those are broad concepts, but here we're looking sort of at it in detail under a microscope, and what is accomplished by that. So we understand Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, and the using the Nefesh Elokis to transform the Nefesh HaBahamas, the Nefesh HaBahamas is the fuel to drive to transform the sechel.
Yeah.
I mean, we're seeing everything under the hood, but with a new perspective.
That's the whole reason we're learning this now.
Yeah, it's very beautiful and very meaningful. Yeah. Anyways,
Good.
thank you. It was a wonderful class. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to stop here at the end of the paragraph on 14.